So in the last video we looked at estimating a time frame for a potential Bitcoin peak, assuming that the peak that we've just seen in March at 70-ish thousand was not the cycle peak. Our range that we came to conclude was roughly from the start of February of the next year to October of 2025. This video will be about estimating a price range at which a cycle top for Bitcoin could be expected, assuming that, again, this peak was not the cycle peak for Bitcoin. There's no way of knowing for sure when or at what price Bitcoin will peak, or what time frame, now that we're on the matter, but a general idea can help navigate the market better. So our first metric that we will be looking at is simply the price increase from the previous tops to the following peak. If we just get a price range here and look at the first cycle from the first cycle peak to the second, we can see it was roughly a 3,800% increase. From the second cycle peak to the third cycle peak, we can see it was roughly a 1,500% increase. And then from the 2017 high to the latest cycle high, we can see that it was 250% roughly. So the first thing that stands out is simply that the returns are diminishing from one cycle to the next. So I think it's fair to assume that for the peak that either has happened or will happen in the near future, it will be less than a 250% increase from the previous high. So if we just put this onto here, I feel fairly confident saying that Bitcoin will probably not peak above 250,000 this cycle. Another interesting thing to look at is looking at the ratio of one cycle compared to the next. So if I pull up a calculator here and look at the first cycle, which was 3,800, call it 50%, and we divide that by the next cycle here, which is 1480, we can see that it gives us a ratio of roughly 2.6. So let's just keep this one in mind and look for the following cycle. So if we look at 1480 divided by 247, this gives us roughly 6. So can I see the, what was it, 2.6 I think. So we know that it's roughly the cycle before has gained on average 4 times as much as the cycle afterwards, and since we know that the cycle before this current one gained 247%, so if we do 247 divided by the number that we just found, 6, that gives us a 40% upside using the lower value, and the first one we found was 2.6. so if we do 247 divided by 2.6 gives us 95% to the upside, which would, on current price, give us an upside of roughly 150,000, which does sound a lot more realistic than the 250,000 that would be the price if we saw the same sort of gains as we did in the previous cycle in 2017. So our second metric that we will be looking at is similar, and it will be the increase from the cycle low. If I take the calculator away, so from this low to the high, this is going to get messy quite quickly, so I'll just put this off to the side. You can see it was a 62,000% increase. From this low to the high, see it was a 12,000% increase. From this low to the high, 2000% increase. Again, I think it's fair to assume that the gain from one cycle to the next will be diminishing. So if we take a 2000% increase from here, we get roughly the same 250 to 300,000 range that seems quite unattainable. But again, if we look at the ratios, 62,000 to 12,000, that's roughly divided by 6. So if we just write that down, divided by 6. And then from this one, 2,000, 12,000, that again is divided by 6. So following this pattern, the gain from the cycle low down here to a potential cycle high out in 2025, if we simply divide 2,000, so let's get our calculator back up, 2,100, 2,100 divided by 6 gives us 350% from the bottom, which would give us, well, I was going to say slightly more upside, but it's actually what we've just reached. So according to this metric, the cycle high is potentially what we've just seen. So this does come across as a more conservative approach. Our next metric is I'm sure you've all seen it, is simply a logarithmic regression for Bitcoin, which I've customized with my own values to make it a bit more, how would you say it, conservative than the other ones out there. But if we extrapolate this linearly, sort of draw this out, we can see that it sort of has it peaking. This, again, the two blue lines are the boundaries where we would sort of expect Bitcoin to peak according to our previous video. So if we assume Bitcoin peaks at the top of this logarithmic channel, this would estimate a peak roughly around 200,000, which is still below the upper boundary from the first metric we looked at, and more in line with the second metric that we looked at, which was the gain from cycle top to cycle top. So if we sort of put a box here around where we could expect a high, for now I think this is a fair assumption. So we do have another two models left. Our first one is the Bitcoin wave model, which was I talked about it in the previous video. This also has Bitcoin peaking roughly at the same area as my logarithmic regression, though this one is a bit less conservative. So if we sort of drag this out to match our values, and the final metric I wanted to actually look at is something is a bit less, how would you say, numbery, and it's more drawing lines, which I'm not necessarily a fan of. But basically, if you draw a line from one cycle bottom to the next and drag the top of the channel to match the cycle high in between those two lows, the midpoint in between those two lines has marked off the peak here, also marked off the peak for the next cycle. If I take it from here to here, you can see that it peaked at the midpoint line here. This is getting very messy. I might just clear off a few indicators, and this one. So as you can see, it has it peaking at the midline here, So if we take a channel, again from one low to the next, match it with the high of the previous cycle, and once again, if we take our estimated peaking time frame, match it with the midpoint line, which is here, it sort of again points towards a rough range of 125,000 to maybe 200,000 upside. So yeah, that's my expectations for this cycle. I'm more conservative, so 125 is my target. Anything above, I suppose, will be extra gains. So overall, a lot of our indicators point to a range between maybe 120 to 200 upside. I do position myself more on the conservative side of things, so hitting 125k next year would be when I consider Bitcoin to be peaking, and would probably be looking to take larger amounts out of Bitcoin and into other investments. But again, our range does consider maybe even 200,000 as possible. Make of that what you will, and I hope this has been useful for you.